ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the 2022 DINFOS Social Media Forum. I've got the honor, the privilege to introduce you guys to Mr. Andy Orr. He's the Director of Social Media up at OSDPA. So welcome. Thank you for your time.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Tell us a little bit about your job, your position, your role, and what you do.
Sure. So I'm the Director of Digital Media for OSD. And I've never had a job like this before. I've never even seen a job like this before. And I cover a wide area of responsibility. A couple of the things are, number one, I run basically all of the social and digital communications for the Secretary. So I manage his Twitter account, I write his messaging, I travel with him when he goes overseas for the most part. And it's been really great to get a front row seat to history, really, through his eyes, and being able to speak through him is obviously the privilege of a lifetime. On the other side of the spectrum, I have worked on, along with some amazing colleagues in our policy office, a DOD-wide social media policy. So I've been lucky, I think, to have been empowered to look across the department to see what are some of the gaps, broadly speaking, that exist, and how can we at OSD help without being too much of a pain. And then in between that, I support a lot of the folks in the operations and really just sort of the general messaging operation at OSDPA. So whether that's our press conferences, anytime we do rolling out a social media account or a digital media account for another principal, so for instance, the Deputy Secretary Hicks, or some of our policy higher-ups, I sort of play a tangential advisory role there. So it's been a wild ride, and it touches a lot of different things, and no 2 days are similar. But that's kind of a taste of what I do.
Oh, wow. Wow. That is a heavy load, especially at that level. Yeah. Now, you mentioned a little bit about the policy, DOD 5400 Tech 17, that just came out. Can you give us just like a general overview of what that entails?
Sure. Well, I guess I'll start by sort of describing how and why it came to be. So when I got in early January of 2021, along with John Kirby and a bunch of our OSDPA leadership. And one of the things that we wanted to do was take a look at, just operationally, how do things or don't things work here at the department. And I think one of the things that surprised us, frankly, was we were caught off guard a couple of times by some social media activity, official social media activity, that I don't think I or Mr. Kirby or really most people, I think, would have deemed within the lines of what would be appropriate from a DOD account. Right. And this is like one in a million stuff, but it's that one bad apple that spoils things for a lot of different people. And then we did a little bit of research with our friends from policy to figure out that there is no overarching policy that governs these things. I actually met with my predecessor, a woman named Stephanie Dreyer, who held this role a few years ago, and she informed me that she had began an effort to put something in place, but ultimately didn't have the time, didn't have the support in the time that she had, and so it didn't go anywhere. And that's what inspired us to start on this journey, and we wanted to create something that was, first of all, I think first and foremost, coordinated very closely with the services. And that doesn't necessarily mean the services are going to agree with every letter that's in there, but making sure they were part of the process from the beginning, because really we just sort of represent them. And as far as social media goes, it's the services and the components and the units that are really, I think, doing the heavy lifting. OSD just has a couple of accounts, but the Army, I don't even know how many they might have. So we wanted to put out something that was sort of a mediated solution amongst the wildly divergent views, and I think we landed on that. But again, we wanted something that folks who were social media managers or public affairs officers could point to show their senior leadership, hey, this is how we're supposed to operate. We're not, you might have an opinion on how things should be, or you might want to say something that your public affairs office might not be cool with, but there's some governance in place. And that was actually one of the biggest demand signals that we heard when we first went out to the COCOMs and the services was make it clear that social media activity is the responsibility of public affairs. And I think that was actually one of the most important things, hopefully, that we put in there to establish that. So that's just a little bit of background, I think, about how the genesis.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, what's that process even look like? Like, how do you even begin to get at something this large?
Yeah.
This
right. Well, literally, I began by reaching out to my counterpart at the Marine Corps, who I had a little bit of a relationship with, and said, hey, do you think this would be crazy? And that person at the time was like, no, I would fully support that. And let me introduce you to this guy at the Army, this woman at the Navy. And then it started from there, and I sort of formed a core group of really kind of a working group amongst myself and the services to figure out what do you want, what do you need, what makes sense. And really that sort of first draft we kind of all wrote together. Obviously it's changed a lot since then, especially since the lawyers got all involved. But that's their job. But that's where I wanted to start. I wanted it to be written and conceived by social media managers, not by CIO, not by WHS, not by OGC, but by us, by PA, and specifically by social and digital media managers. And then once we got support from that core group, it was a lot easier for us to go to our policy shop to say, hey, look, we've got support for this. Again, me sort of managing up, working with Mr. Kirby and even his leadership to get support for this. I think that was a really critical sort of pre-coordination working group that we put together to make sure that we were on the right track.
It sounds like leadership plays a huge role in this, I would assume.
Yeah.
How did you even begin to get that leadership buy-in? Was that something that they were looking for themselves, or something that you guys kind of suggested the other way?
It was. I didn't have to do very much, and I have to say I've got to credit John Kirby again, because if there was anybody who was more ravenous about making sure we did this, it was him. That obviously helps a lot. When your commanding officer is completely aligned and pushing for something that's even harder than you, that opened up, everything. And I also think that because we went through this the right way, our policy team, which is here today, they are pros at how to navigate the coordination process of how to make sure these things are done the right way. And we knew it was going to take time. It was going to be hard. We were going to have to make concessions. We weren't going to make every single service, every single unit perfectly happy. But we just kind of chipped away and kept working on it. Yeah, but leadership was important for sure. Okay.
Any key highlights that we need to be, obviously I don't want to go through the entire policy.
Yeah.
Make sure you read the policy. Which one? Read the policy. But is there, key takeaway, what's my elevator pitch, I guess?
Well, I mentioned one. I think one thing that I want to stress is that this puts the jurisdiction of social media accounts, with a couple of exceptions, a marketing exception and an operational security exception. Besides that, it establishes social media accounts as a public affairs equity. And I think that's, again, important to understand, because it hopefully empowers our public affairs officers, our social media managers, to, again, be able to point to something to OSD, that's something that OSD put out, saying, we own this, we are probably the best qualified to work these channels, so let us own them. The other section that I would just broadly, highlight is we have a sort of principles of social media. I think it's section 2 or 3. And the principles was really sort of the philosophical regurgitation of the conversations between myself and Mr. Kirby and some of our leadership. And it outlines just some, things that everyone in this room would think are foregone conclusions. But I think it's helpful to actually just write this stuff down because I run a social media account. I care very deeply about my principal. I see things people say about him. I want to like clap back every now and then. I obviously won't, but it's important just to have something again on paper that reminds us as social media managers the very basic principles that we should be following. So making sure we're doing things with professionalism and decorum, making things are put out in a timely manner, making sure things are put out through the right channel. Another one of our principles has to do with the creation of new accounts. I'm sure it's not a surprise to anybody in this room. There's been a tremendous proliferation of accounts being created, and we wanted to put something in there that generally discouraged that. Unless there was a specific strategic communications need that was not met anywhere else. And that's obviously not a blanket no statement, but it is a really take a look and really judge whether or not you need to create a new account or you're just siphoning off followers from somewhere else. And so there are a few things I think in that third section, the principles, which are really sort of, again, where we started from that are important to really soak in.
Okay. I want to talk a little bit about, managing the platforms for Secretary of Defense. I mean, that's pretty, it's a heavy lift. Like, what are the considerations? Like, what do you think about when you're talking about managing those platforms?
Yeah, that's a great question because I've never managed an account for anyone like this before.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, it is terrifying because I have to make sure that my personal account is completely logged out of everything all the time. The solution that I personally have found for that is I have not tweeted in a year and a half. And I'm just not going to because I'm terrified, like I said, of putting something out. There are also some rules, Hatch Act, et cetera, that prevent me as a political appointee from doing stuff. So frankly, that helps. But I think the most important thing for me has been, again, getting that access to him or to his activity or his schedule, and certainly the people that create the policies that he has to go around the world and talk about. That has been really important. And I think in terms of how I manage the actual account itself, I'll be honest, you probably all have way better sprinkler setups and that kind of a thing. And so it's really been a case of I just sort of never give myself a mental break, which again I'm probably don't do what I do. But this is just how I feel I have to do it. And I'm very deliberate about, we were just before the break discussing what happens when I go on leave. I have a very specific person that I hand it off to, and then that person hands it back off to me. We've also, I think one of the things that I tried to do is get very specific about his tone. I like to think of the Secretary of Defense as literally the most serious person on social media. And it's actually such a black and white way to think about it that it kind of makes things easy, right? So no exclamation points, no emojis besides a country flag, you know what I mean? If you're running the Army handle or something, you have a lot more room to play with, but as the Secretary is concerned, I'm way over here in this box, and I stay in that box, and that kind of simplifies things. So I understand his voice, I understand how he wants to communicate about things on a basic level, and then our public affairs team does a great job of distilling information about, if he, for instance, today, just this morning, did a bilat with his Japanese counterpart at the Pentagon. So we have a great public affairs team that will translate what happened at that meeting and summarize what we want to say about it. And I will just take some of that and put it in his voice, find the most important thing, and go from there. I don't know if that helps at all. I mean, I wouldn't follow my advice here, but it's just how I do it, and it's worked out okay so far.
Right.
Yeah.
Huh. Interesting. Now, I would assume at that level, you probably get a lot of negativity as well as positive. I mean, how do How do you deal with, what about the comment section? How do we deal with engagement? How do you deal with engagement? Is there any engagement?
Yeah, this is a really good question, and I've been in a lot of, I used to work at PR firms, and our clients would ask us this stuff all the time. I mean, my philosophy is it completely depends. Personally, I have never, ever been a fan of deleting comments or censoring comments or censoring anything. And I also understand that things can get out of hand. You know, I'll think back to a situation last year when, you know, the secretary, we were over in the Philippines, and the Philippines at the time, COVID was completely decimating that country. This was, I think, 2 Julys ago. And they had very, very, very strict requirements for foreigners coming in to visit the country. We had to wear masks, we had to wear a face shield. And that was something that we did out of respect for them. But some of the pictures obviously made it look like the secretary, where, if you remember at that point, COVID was sort of very mild here. And some of our detractors looked at that and said, look at this, you know, crazy, he's going crazy about COVID, blah, blah, blah. You know, a lot of, you know, this is our woke secretary. And that was an interesting situation where we did get a lot of negative comments, but in no circumstance, under no circumstance would I ever consider engaging directly from that account. First of all, that is not the Secretary of Defense's place. I think he kind of rises above all of that. So we really just kind of went about our business, right? Now maybe there is a situation in which we respond to something in a different way. Maybe maybe our press secretary, for instance, puts out a statement or a tweet that addresses the fact that actually this was a requirement by the country, and that's what you do when you want to go respect someone else's country and their culture. We didn't even have to do that, luckily, because some of our reporters that were on the trip, as well as some people in the social media world who knew better, actually said that for us. And I think that because I think we've built up an authentic presence, we are not bomb throwers. So I don't think people necessarily, it's weird, I think, when people sort of glom onto the secretary, for instance. So there's that gut check of, well, are they really attacking him for a right reason? You know, this is not a guy that makes any, you know, faux pas out there. And so quickly, people that I think were more logical said, wait a minute, no, you got this all wrong. But again, I for that instance, I would never, ever consider responding back to someone. I think that that's probably pretty basic. And I would probably broadly encourage that as well. I mean, we are all, at the end of the day, representatives of the Department of Defense, and so whether you're representing, you're tweeting for the Secretary, or you're tweeting for a new, you know, initiative with a blue check mark next to your name, you still represent the department. So if you're going to clap back at somebody, that's as good as the department, you know, clapping back at someone, and our press office will probably have to answer for that. So I don't know. I mean, I know too that comments can get out of hand. Obviously, there are mechanisms to report that kind of activity. Certainly, anybody who's on a platform has to follow the terms of service. So that's just my personal philosophy. Kind of went on longer than I wanted to there.
No, you're fine. Yeah. And please, guys, if you have any questions, just approach one of the mics. Well, we got them here. So we're talking a little bit about some of the things that you guys have done. What about lessons learned? Is there anything that, you know, that you've experienced in your time there that it's like, man, you know, maybe I should never do this on social, or something that we should be, you know, kind of doing?
I guess a lesson learned, well, the thing that's on my mind right now that I want to try to do better is be more proactive, actually. I think, especially in my lens as the secretary, it's very easy for me to say no to things. Like, I don't want to amplify that, or I don't want to get involved in this. But there are a lot of really interesting things happening, and a lot of really important things happening that we haven't really dipped our toes too far into yet. I think of a lot of the work, the incredibly important work that we're doing on the AI front, the cyber front, sort of the new, sort of these emerging advanced technologies. Deputy Secretary Hicks is very focused on this material. Her Twitter account, actually, she's always talking about this stuff. That's an area where I'd like to see if I can get, if I can get the secretary, I would just do it. But talk about some of that from the secretary's voice as well, where appropriate. Obviously the Ukraine stuff has been a huge, huge, huge message for us. We were heavy on that stuff a few months ago, and it's kind of tapered as, I think Russia's unjust invasion continues into its 8th month here, or 6th month. But I think that it's important not only for our military, but also our allies and partners, and for the Ukrainians to keep that drumbeat going. Just last week, the Secretary was in Ramstein, at Ramstein Air Base, holding a contact group with more than 50 of his counterparts from all over the world to again discuss how can we continue to help Ukraine. That was an incredible moment for us. I think it was our 2nd highest engaged sort of moment overall since he's been in the chair. Creating more moments like that, where maybe we don't have to get 50 leaders in a room together. Maybe there's something else that we can do that won't reach that level of engagement, but trying to be more proactive and thinking through how can I better and more proactively capitalize on some of these things.
Okay.
Yeah.
You talk a lot about voice. I've heard you mention that a few times. How do you even begin to establish something like that?
Honestly, just listening to him a lot. He talks a lot because he has to publicly talk all the time. He's actually a pretty kind of reserved individual, like off the cuff. He's not an off the cuff type of guy. Some defense secretaries, some are, and that's a whole different ball of wax that I frankly don't know how to deal with. The secretary is very economic with his words, and that actually in a weird way has helped me, because you have to be very economic with your words on Twitter. And so I will, I just think in having heard him and having read so many things that are put out in his voice from our speech team, from our policy team, I've gotten a good sense of how he talks, how he thinks, what he wants to say, what he doesn't want to say. And I think for the most part we get it right. Again, I think the thing that makes it easy is if I think of him as the most serious person on Twitter, which I think he should be, even more so than the president. I really do believe that, because when you tweet from the Department of Defense or the Secretary of Defense, that means something completely different, especially for an ally or even adversary. It really kind of simplifies it for me. And again, I would hope that in a way it simplifies things for a lot of our social media managers, because again, no matter what you say, no matter how cute you want to get, at the end of the day, you're still representing the Secretary, the Defense Department, the military. And when the U.S. military says something, that's one thing I've learned. When the U.S. military says something, it carries a lot of weight all around the world. And sometimes it's easy to forget that.
Yeah, I agree. Well, let me check my, see if I got any questions online here.
Sure.
Okay. Okay, good. Not that I see. Wait. I forget people are following me on different places.
Yeah. Yeah, they are.
Yeah. No, this has been really educational though. And I think I got a question in the studio while we wait on that.
Okay.
What do you got, Bill?
Afternoon, sir. What parts of the policy were you and the policy team the most adamant about making sure got into this current draft?
I would go, for me personally, it was the principles. Again, that is where this whole thing started. And we wanted to make sure that a very basic level of how you should think philosophically about these accounts are run. We even tried to see if it was possible to release the principles before as kind of a separate memo. Wasn't really the right thing to do. But I think it was those principles that really were the guiding thing, the reason we did it in the first place, and the thing I personally feel like is most important in there. Yeah.
What type of feedback have you guys gotten as far as the?
It's been largely positive.
Yeah.
We've certainly got a lot of questions. Andrew Frisano and I hosted a series of office hours over the last couple of weeks, receiving questions, and we're actually going to be putting out a Q&A, which dives a little bit deeper into some of the questions, the biggest questions that we've got. But for the most part, I think we've heard a lot of feedback that the policy is very thorough, very well written. It is a policy document. It's not bedtime reading necessarily, right. But I think another thing that I want to stress, would want to stress about the policy is, we also, I forget exactly the verbiage, but we state in there that whoever's running a social media account is also beholden to whatever directives that their commanding office or their service might have. And I think that's important because what we tried to do with the policy, which I hope we did, was write a lot of these things in a way that could be, I don't know if interpreted is the right word, but malleable based on the needs of a certain service. So I'll give you a great example. I won't name them, but we have one service that really wants to be a lot more liberal with what we can say, how we can say it, what service members can do on their accounts, that kind of a thing. That's what they want out of a social media program. We have another service that is the complete opposite. And if you ask them, we wouldn't have any social media accounts at all. Again, I'm not going to name names. But what we hope is that this document meets in the middle a little bit, but also empowers both of those offices to take it a step further. So I've seen some incredible handbooks just at the service level. The Marine Corps, for instance, the Navy has a great one. The Army has this beautiful website, I think it's army.mil/social media, that takes, I think the principles are pretty much in line with everybody else. But it takes those and then interprets them as to, okay, and here's how we want you to think about running your social media accounts. Right. And what the Army puts out might be wildly different from what Marine Corps puts out. And that's okay. And we wanted that. And we want to make sure there's room for interpretation and diversity in terms of how these accounts are run. So that's the other thing that I would stress is that just because there's a policy out, I don't think it means stop thinking about how to run these things at a philosophical, managerial level.
Right. Yeah, it's always important, I think, we say in the class that, to look at my left and right lateral limits.
Exactly.
And I think that's definitely what the service policy letters do, and I'm sure this aligns with that as well. So
yeah,
no,
that's the goal.
Yeah, that's pretty good. Any questions from the audience, guys? I got one in the back. Let's make your way to the microphone here.
Hi.
Joey Syke, National Defense University. One of the things that stood out to me about the policy, well, one of the sections was the part about contractor involvement. I know a lot of agencies have contractors that are very involved in social media. Do you see social media moving towards almost an inherently governmental function or adjacent to that?
Not necessarily. I think contractors are incredibly valuable. I don't know exactly if we have any. I can tell you for a fact we don't have a philosophical view on that one way or the other. I also think too, contractors can be specifically helpful when, when you think about resourcing a social media program. You can't always put a person on it. And one of the things that I've been adamant about, at least personally, is I run the Secretary's Twitter, but I don't run any other accounts. And I think that's one account is usually enough for one person. So if your component is responsible for 10 accounts, that doesn't mean you have 10 people, certainly. Maybe you have one person, maybe you have half of a person. And so if you're able to, if it makes better economic sense to do the contractor route, then absolutely, I think we would encourage that. Yeah, yeah.
I had a kind of a question from a recruiter earlier.
Yeah.
You know, because they're kind of different. You know, a lot of times a recruiter will come out of a job field. I know when I went on recruiting duty, I was in communications. I was a data guy.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and now I'm on recruiting duty, and a lot of times our recruiters are tasked with these social media platforms. I mean,
Yeah.
did we look to address that at all, and that kind of dispute?
Great question. So actually, if I go back to a comment I made earlier, recruitment, or I think what we call marketing, is one of the two operations in which this policy does not directly apply.
Oh, okay.
So there's a lot of, in this policy, for instance, there's stuff about personal use, there's stuff about endorsements. That does not apply to the marketing operation.
Right.
I will say that, you know, again, when we put this out, social media for public affairs purposes, and as far as I'm aware, there's a pretty clear line between public affairs and marketing most everywhere you go. I will say personally, I think that there's more work that we could do to maybe, I don't know, but if they're at least work more closely with some of the marketing teams to make sure that we're supporting each other, that's something that I would certainly be open to at an OSD level. I know some of the services, my counterparts of the services, are exploring this. It's been a difficult line to navigate, but I think now is a perfect time to start thinking about what can we do to collaborate. But from a marketing perspective, this policy specifically doesn't really touch that stuff. You know, I will say I've seen, especially from the services, I'm channeling my counterpart from the Navy. You know, there's been a lot of emphasis on vertical video, making sure that the tactics that we're using and the platforms we're using are up to date. You know, a lot of show versus tell. We've been talking, for instance, about an effort where the Secretary had some initiatives around economic security and food security and housing security. How do we actually show these things as opposed to, you know, just saying, here's the policy? These are things that I see marketing teams do really well, and recruiters do really well, a lot of showing. Of course, I'm not in that world, but I would like to glean some of the lessons that they have, because they have obviously amazing social media operations, and inject a little bit more of that into some of the stuff we're doing. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's good. I think it's important to align both. It's funny, I always think back when I was just launching social media for the Marine Corps, we'd always be at odds at one another with Nick Rick and Headquarters Marine Corps. It was just like this. It's like,
Yeah, no, we should be in the same room, I think. I don't know.
Because I think at the end of the day, it's all about the branding and everything that's involved with that. So
Yeah.
So we'll talk a little bit legal. I don't want to get too legal.
I'm happy to. That's why I have my lawyers here.
Yeah, right. But what role did that play when you're, again, building a policy like this?
Yeah.
How important was it to bring in like your legal team or what have you?
Well, it was mandatory.
Yeah.
We had to, you know, this process, I don't know what else to tell you.
Just walk in. What are we talking about?
It got completely fine-tooth combed by the lawyers. OGC was very helpful. You know, and they think of things that a right-brain person like me would never think of. And so, yeah, they were instrumental. WHS had a big hand in it, OGC, the CIO. The CIO, I will say, was one of our very first partners, going back to that very first conversation we had, figuring out where the jurisdiction was. And, you know, it was actually written, and I think it was 8170, where in 2012 or 10, I believe this was written, that they were at that point in time under the CIO jurisdiction, and bringing them out of that and putting them under public affairs. The CIO, for the most part, was like, "Oh yeah, that makes total sense. We should, you know." So they were a really crucial partner. But yeah, no, I mean the lawyers completely rewrote some of the sections, and we rewrote them back. You know, you guys know how it works, but couldn't have done it without legal.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow.
I know. It took a year and a half, year and 8 months.
Really?
But that's how, yeah. I mean, that's how long I think something like this should take.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
All right. Another question?
Hello.
Hi.
Hi. So I wanted to know, earlier you mentioned about the working group that you had established in creating this DOD policy. Is there a working group for digital media for the senior leaders, OSD-wide, possibly?
Yeah.
Like a peer-to-peer?
We have one that we do have one. We do a monthly meeting with my counterparts at the services and at the COCOM level. Where do you sit?
OSD Arnie.
Oh, okay, yeah. No, I think that we should probably talk after. We need to find a way to better incorporate the OSD offices. Because that happens at a sort of service level, but it doesn't happen at an OSD level.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, these are offices that I want to empower more to feel comfortable. I get the sense that a lot of our OSD friends aren't super comfortable wading into the social media water, and that makes sense. And OSD, frankly, is one of the areas where I would really love to see us pull back on accounts. But that doesn't mean we should do nothing. And I think there's a lot more we can do. So maybe let me get your business card afterwards, and we can email and figure something out.
Absolutely, would
Yeah.
love to. I'm part of a weekly integration group, part of the OSD PA integration group, but we
PA?
don't. Yeah, but we
Yeah.
don't discuss digital media. It's really, you
Yeah.
know, look.
Yeah, no. The PIG is a little bit, what does it stand for? PA
PIG.
integration, they call it the PIG.
Big.
PA integration group. Yeah, it's a little bit more traditional media.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
you.
Of course.
It's interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think how important was, and we might have mentioned this already, but how important was that integration, that crosstalk between the, getting buy-in from other
Yeah.
services when putting something out like this?
Well, on two levels, it was really important, I think, again, to reiterate at the beginning, let's make sure we're all starting from a common philosophy here.
Yeah.
That's where I think it was most important. The second area where it was most important was, again, just like legal, it was required that this went through the services. So their policy people got chops at this. They were allowed to say, we concur with this, we don't concur with that. So we really kind of had two touch points. One was at the beginning and a more informal. And that's not to say that through our monthly meetings we were always kind of talking about it and giving updates about where it was and that kind of a thing. But just like with legal, it needed a part of a formal coordination process. Means that they had their lay of it, to really make their comments known, and they did, and they were all, willing participants in that process. So I would say that was the other key point was at that moment in time, and I think it was a month or two long where they had time to get in their comments, and Andrew and his team went through all of them and addressed them or didn't address them and said, we need to go back to you on this. And so, there was a negotiation, I think, for probably upwards of 50 to 100 different little nits and this and that, mostly, I think, from the services and from legal, through that formal coordination process of a policy like this.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Anything else from the audience, studio? Question over here.
Hi, I had a question regarding the personal use section. It's probably what our public affairs office gets asked about the most in our unit from our soldiers.
Yeah.
And the policy, I think, can be interpreted pretty stringently or maybe not so stringently. And I was wondering, with the Q&A that you had mentioned coming out, will there be like examples of appropriate use? Additionally, we had recently started using the new Army Ambassadors program. Is that something that is going to continue in light of this new policy? Will that be changing? Just some things that kind of cross in terms of marketing and social media that we often get asked about, and we're not too sure how to answer yet.
Yeah, great question. I think so as far as the Q&A, it absolutely is going to address some of that. Here's what I'll tell you. The reason that section is in there, first of all, is this policy was issued to address guidance on official accounts. And at some point during that coordination process, it became clear that in order to define an official account, you also had to define what a personal account is. And so what we wanted to do was not put anything in there that was again, beyond common sense, that was too stringent or too lax, because we frankly really did not want to go down too deep of a hole of road with that. And there, I think, are certainly some UCMJ implications. So the way I think about it is this is, I would hope, a common sense approach for just a couple of things that you shouldn't do on your personal account. So number one, don't get up there and act like you are speaking on behalf of anyone besides yourself. We've had a lot of questions about, like, can I appear in uniform? Can I have my rank up there? And it's a sort of a tricky scenario, because while, yes, there are ways that you can do that, what you don't want to do is by any way imply that you're speaking for the U.S. Army, because it's written right here. So there are certainly case-by-case scenarios in which that will be different, but it's not a blanket, no, don't do that. The other one is, don't make any crazy political statements. You'd be surprised how, maybe you wouldn't be surprised how often that happens. Both sides, and sides I've never even heard of, have very strong views about politics. And if you do that with the uniform on, that's going to get everybody in trouble. And then the third one was endorsements, like I mentioned earlier. So we, again, we want to make sure people are getting up there and, you know, let's say you have a pretty successful, like, workout program that you actually do on the side, and that's your side hustle. Assuming that you've cleared that with your commanding officer and with your ethics office, that's the first check. We, again, don't want you up there representing the Army, the Air Force, even your unit, if that's not what the goal is. If you're up there and you're in your plain clothes and you're, you know, I actually don't know the rules there, but the point is, we don't want, again, it to be misconstrued that the Navy is sponsoring Monster Energy drink because this, you know, E6 loves Monster and they can't stop talking about it, and they say the Navy loves Monster. So that's really the point. It wasn't to, like, I think, restrict people, even though I understand that's how I think a lot of these things could be interpreted. I do think the Q&A addresses a lot of that. Yeah, and the other thing I'll say is it's also another reason, I think, to have that follow-on step of a handbook or some kind of guidance from the service or the unit to say, here's, you know, frankly, I don't know that anybody besides you guys should be reading that entire 55-page document or whatever it is. Find the 6 things that matter most to your people and say, here's the 6 things that matter most to you, and here's how I want you to respond to these. Sure.
Other question.
Good afternoon. I actually haven't had a chance to read it yet, but I'm curious. One, does it address anywhere intergovernment communications or collaboration? And if it doesn't, I mean, how do you feel about that? I mean, because there are times service members need to hear from other agencies, like let's say the DOD and IRS working together to talk about tax time, things of that nature. So does the policy address that, or what are your thoughts?
Doesn't address it as far as I know, but I think it's something that we should try to do better at. We work a lot, for instance, with the State Department. We're working right now with the Secretary of Veterans Affairs on some Suicide Prevention Month messaging. If you're working with another U.S. government entity, there really aren't very many restrictions as far as I know, right? Yeah. So I would say have at it. Obviously, you know, it's tough to coordinate interagency things, but if you think it's smart, again, you know, maybe read our principles and then ask yourself again, like, should I really be talking to people about tax day or like tax issues with the IRS? And if the answer is yes, then go for it. But make sure you're maybe doing that DOD mental check and making sure you're familiar with the principles and some of the stuff that we lay out about messaging. Again, I think that's in Section 3. And then, yeah, I mean, there's certainly no restrictions on working with other entities in the government, the U.S. government, to get our messages out.
Great. Anything else, guys? Questions, comments, concerns? No? Let me do a quick check here.
Yeah.
Nothing that I see. So is there anything like, I guess if there was a driving home point here, something you wanted to say either about policy or even managing from your perspective. I know you talked about like managing just one platform.
Yeah.
You know, like how does that? How do you even like try to determine like what platform do I want to use, and then sticking to that one platform?
That's a great question. Yeah. Well, I'm only on Twitter with the secretary.
Yeah.
Early on, there was discussion: should he get on Facebook? Should he get on Instagram? And again, I have it easy, I think, in a way, because he's the most serious person in the world, and Twitter is the, I think, unfortunately, most serious platform that's out there.
All right.
Even though you certainly get your trolls and your haters and your bots and all that. But, you know, I mean, we have other platforms to amplify things, and so that's what made sense for him. If you are running a recruitment account, it probably really makes sense for you to dig into Instagram Reels, to YouTube Shorts. Mm-hmm. Again, these sort of vertical video platforms that are really popular right now. Mm-hmm. If you're running, if you're running an Air Force channel, it probably makes sense for you to be on Instagram so you can show beautiful photos of your aircraft or whatever. So yeah, I think these are pretty common sense questions that people should ask themselves. I also, just personally speaking, really don't think there's any kind of mandate. There's really any kind of mandate to be on all of these platforms. Right. I'll be honest, some of our leadership has asked ourselves really hard questions about the department's presences and should we be on this platform? Mm. Is there really a benefit? Mm-hmm. Are we reaching anyone there that we're not reaching anywhere else? And is the trouble worth the, whatever we gain from it? And, obviously it's hard for a Department of Defense level account to walk itself back and, come off of a platform. But I think it's always a question you should be asking yourself, and our account managers should be asking, are we on the right platforms? Are there new ones that we should think about getting on? I think there's this new platform, Be Real. Mm. I don't know how we would use that, but I think it's an interesting question. Mm. Like, how would we even begin to think about using that? Can brands even use it? Right. So I don't know. Assuming I don't know if they're. I don't know much about. I'm actually not on it myself, but it sounds cool. Mm. And if there's an opportunity again for us to reach people, especially from the recruiting angle, I mean, maybe that's something that makes sense.
Yeah. Okay. Any parting words of advice?
No. Keep it up. Thanks for everything you're doing. Hopefully, what we're doing in the policy is helpful for you. Again, we did this with the intention of making it so that you could go to your commanding officers or whoever is managing your team or your presences and say, here's what OSD says. And hopefully that's helpful. But keep an eye on we have a defense.gov/social media, I believe it is, or maybe there's a dash in there somewhere. That's where we're going to release the Q&A, hopefully in a couple of weeks. I think that'll be helpful. And it's sort of a little summary of not only the policy, the main points in the policy, but also some other relevant policies. It's not the only policy out there. I would say thanks for your support and good luck managing these channels. I know it's not easy, personally.
Absolutely. And then one last thing. I know you keep talking about Q&A. Is there a way for people, if they're out there, to submit questions? Or?
Yeah, there's not a great way. I think we have a mailbox right now. I don't know if there's a way to broadcast that mailbox, but we can maybe work with you to make sure the participants get it here or we get it out. Okay. Does that work?
Yeah.
Okay.
Works for me.
Cool.
All right. Hey,
Thank you.
I appreciate it, man. I appreciate your time.
Absolutely. This is fun.
All right, guys, we're going to take a short break. We'll be back right after these messages. As if we have messages, right?